Explosions tore through the night sky like furious suns, and the air smelled of burning metal and ash. The ground trembled with every impact, and the screams of the dying mixed with the deafening roar of orbital strikes. Commander Ryan Voss sprinted through the wreckage, his combat suit's HUD flashing with danger alerts. His breathing was heavy, his heart pounding against his ribs as he navigated the burning ruins of what used to be a Zilari outpost. The war between humanity and the Zilari Dominion had turned this planet into a graveyard, and every step Ryan took reminded him of the cost. The comm in his helmet crackled with frantic voices. His squad was being pushed back, their numbers dwindling fast. He gritted his teeth, knowing they wouldn't last much longer. The Zilari's technology was far superior, their war machines faster and deadlier. But humans had one thing the Zilari underestimated: resilience. Ryan pushed forward, determined to complete his mission and bring his men home, or die trying. As he advanced through the remains of a downed Zilari warship, his motion scanner suddenly picked up a faint life sign. It was weak, barely there, but unmistakable. Blaster drawn, Ryan moved toward the twisted wreckage with caution. Every step felt heavier as his instincts screamed danger. Inside the broken hull, amidst the flickering lights and the hiss of leaking gas, he found her. She was lying against the scorched metal, her breathing shallow and uneven. Shimmering violet skin, streaked with blood and soot, and glowing blue eyes half closed in pain. A Zilari girl, young, barely an adult by their standards, battered and broken. Her body was covered in burns and deep cuts, and her delicate face twisted in agony. Ryan's finger hovered over the trigger, years of war telling him to end the threat. But something in her eyes stopped him. Fear, desperation, pleading. For a moment, the sounds of battle faded, and all Ryan could hear was the ragged sound of her breathing. He hesitated, his mind at war with his instincts. The Zilari had slaughtered his people without mercy. He had seen his friends die, his home burned. And yet, this girl was no soldier. She was barely clinging to life. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice softer than he'd meant. He holstered his blaster and knelt beside her. She flinched at his touch, her body trembling, but she didn't resist when he carefully lifted her into his arms. His comm blared again, enemy reinforcements inbound. Ryan's grip on her tightened. They were both trapped behind enemy lines now, and saving this alien girl meant risking his own life. But he couldn't leave her. Not like this. With the sound of approaching mechs growing louder, he ran, carrying her through the flames and shadows with death hot on their heels. The journey through the ruins was a nightmare. Ryan's every step was calculated, his every breath a gamble. Cloaked enemy drones swept the area, their scanners sweeping across the battlefield like silent predators. The girl's weight slowed him down, but he never considered leaving her behind. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her weak voice murmuring words in her alien tongue. Though he couldn't understand her, the fear and pain in her tone were clear. When an enemy patrol spotted them, there was no time to hide. Ryan's training kicked in. His blaster lit up the night with deadly precision. He moved fast, using his cloaking device to disappear into the shadows and strike from unexpected angles. The enemy fell one by one, but they kept coming. His ammo ran low, and exhaustion began to creep in. Just as one of the mechs turned its weapon on him, a weak but well-aimed shot rang out from behind him. The mech collapsed, sparks flying. Ryan spun, shocked, to see the Zilari girl holding a discarded blaster, her hands shaking. "Don't. Leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't. They found temporary shelter in an abandoned outpost, its walls scarred from past battles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy them a few hours of safety. Ryan laid the girl down gently, his heart sinking at how pale she'd become. She needed medical attention. Fast. He worked quickly, treating her wounds with the limited supplies he had. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. The enemy was closing in, and they wouldn't survive another encounter. As he worked, the girl's eyes fluttered open. "Kalara," she whispered. He blinked. "What?" "My name, Kalara." It was the first time she had spoken in his language. He nodded, offering a faint smile. "Ryan," he said softly, "you're safe, Kalara. I won't let them hurt you." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why? Why help me?" He didn't have an answer. Maybe it was the fear in her eyes, the way she had fought to save him despite her injuries, or the simple fact that leaving her behind felt wrong. All he knew was that he wasn't going to let her die. Their moment of calm didn't last long. His motion scanner flashed again. Enemy mechs were closing in fast. He activated his comm, desperate for extraction, but the response was grim. No reinforcements could reach them in time. They were on their own. Ryan armed himself, his jaw set in determination. "Stay behind me," he told Kalara. But she shook her head. "I fight. With you." The enemy hit them like a storm. Mechs and drones poured into the outpost, and Ryan fought like a man possessed. Every shot was precise, every move calculated. Kalara stood by his side, her aim unsteady but determined. Together, they were fierce, but not invincible. A blast knocked Ryan off his feet, his armor cracked, and his vision swimming. Kalara's terrified scream was the last thing he heard before darkness claimed him. When he woke, it was to the sound of human voices. Reinforcements had arrived, pushing the enemy back. Kalara was at his side, her hand gripping his tightly. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now, let me save you." Recovery was slow, but Kalara never left his side. In the safety of a human colony, they grew closer. She wasn't just a survivor. She became his partner, helping humanity understand her people's technology and advocating for peace. Despite everything her people had done, she believed there was a chance for unity. And Ryan believed in her. Their bond deepened, their friendship turning into something more. Kalara confessed that Ryan had shown her more kindness than her own people ever had. And for Ryan, she became a reason to hope, a light in the darkness of war. When the war finally ended, it was Kalara who stood beside humanity, fighting for peace. And when Ryan asked her to stay with him forever, her answer was a tearful, joyous yes. Their wedding was more than a union. It was a symbol. Humans and Zilari alike watched as love bridged the gap between their worlds. But even as peace settled, danger still loomed. There were those who saw their love as a threat. But Ryan and Kalara stood together, ready to face whatever came next. They had survived the worst, and their love had only grown stronger. As they looked toward the stars, hand in hand, they knew one thing. Their story was only just beginning. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and scorched earth. Smoke rose in twisting pillars, and the distant sound of explosions rumbled like a storm. Every step Ryan Voss took was a step closer to death. His combat suit's HUD flashed constant warnings. Enemy movement, low ammunition, and incoming airstrikes. But none of it mattered. Not now. Not with the girl in his arms. Kalara's breathing was shallow, her violet skin pale and streaked with blood. She weighed almost nothing against him, her body limp and broken. He didn't know why he had saved her, a Zilari, one of the enemy, but the thought of leaving her behind had felt wrong. Maybe it was the fear in her glowing blue eyes. Maybe it was the way she had reached for him, even knowing he was human. "Stay with me," he whispered, pushing through the wreckage. The night was alive with danger. Zilari patrols were everywhere, their cloaked drones sweeping the battlefield with silent precision. One wrong move, and they'd both be dead. Kalara murmured something in her alien language, her voice so weak he barely heard it. He tightened his grip on her, his eyes scanning the ruins ahead. He needed shelter, somewhere to regroup, to treat her wounds. But the enemy was closing in. The motion scanner on his wrist pulsed with red blips, too many of them. The first attack came without warning. A drone swooped overhead, its energy cannon spitting fire. Ryan dove behind a collapsed wall, shielding Kalara with his body. The heat from the blast seared his armor, but he didn't flinch. He waited, counting the seconds. As soon as the drone passed, he sprang up, his blaster snapping into position. The shot was clean. The drone fell, its wreckage sparking, but the noise had drawn attention. Ryan's comm crackled. His squad was still out there, fighting for their lives. He couldn't reach them. Not yet. He ran. Every muscle burned, but he didn't stop. Kalara's breath grew more ragged, and his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. They reached a narrow alley between the ruins of two fallen buildings. It was a temporary reprieve, but it wouldn't last. "Hold on," he whispered to her, but she didn't respond. Panic coiled in his chest. He had to move faster. The sound of marching boots froze him. Zilari soldiers were near, their metallic exosuits clanking against the debris. Ryan activated his cloaking device, the air around him shimmering as his body faded from sight. But Kalara wasn't cloaked. She was too weak to move. He pressed her against the shadows, his body shielding her as the patrol passed. They were close enough that he could hear their voices, cold, mechanical, and emotionless. His finger hovered over the trigger. One noise, one wrong breath, and they'd both be dead. The patrol moved on, but the danger wasn't over. The air grew colder, and the sound of approaching mechs sent shivers down his spine. Ryan's comm crackled again, this time with a warning. No reinforcements, they were on their own. The first mech burst through the alley's entrance, its towering frame blocking the only exit. Ryan's blaster lit up the darkness, but the shots barely dented its armor. The mech fired back, and the world exploded. He hit the ground hard, his head ringing. When he opened his eyes, Kalara was trying to crawl toward him, her face twisted with fear. The mech's weapon aimed at them, energy building in its barrel. "No." Kalara's voice was weak but defiant. She reached for a fallen weapon, a Zilari blaster, and fired. The shot was wild and shaky, but it hit the mech's exposed joint. Sparks flew, and the machine stumbled. Ryan didn't waste the opportunity. He was on his feet in an instant, his knife flashing. He climbed the mech's frame, found the weak point, and drove the blade deep. The machine collapsed, its systems failing. For a moment, there was silence. Then Kalara whispered, "Don't. Leave me." His heart twisted. "Never," he promised. They found a temporary haven in the ruins of an old outpost. Ryan laid Kalara down, his hands moving quickly to treat her wounds. Blood stained his fingers, and every shallow breath she took felt like a countdown. He fought the panic rising in his chest. She needed a med bay. She needed more than what he had. "Why? Help me." Her voice was so soft, barely audible. He didn't have an answer. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him. Maybe it was the way she'd fought to save him, even when she could barely stand. Or maybe it was just the simple truth that he couldn't watch one more person die. "Because you're not my enemy," he said finally. Her eyes filled with tears. "Kalara," she whispered. "My name, Kalara." "Ryan," he answered, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe, Kalara. I won't let them hurt you." But safety was a fragile thing. The motion scanner flashed again. More enemies were coming. Ryan knew they couldn't fight another wave. He activated his comm one last time, his voice urgent. "I need extraction. Now." The reply was grim. "No ships available. You're on your own." He looked at Kalara, her face pale and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. But when the first explosion sounded outside their shelter, she didn't flinch. "I fight. With you," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The enemy came like a storm. Drones and mechs poured into the ruins, their weapons blazing. Ryan moved without thinking, his every shot precise. Kalara stayed by his side, her aim unsteady but fierce. Together, they fought. And for a while, It felt like they might win. But hope was a fragile thing, too. A blast knocked Ryan off his feet, his armor cracked and his vision swimming. The last thing he saw was Kalura's face, twisted with fear. Her scream followed him into the darkness. When he woke, it was to the sound of human voices. Reinforcements had arrived, pushing the enemy back. And Kalura was there, her hand gripping his tightly. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now, let me save you." Recovery was slow, but Kalura never left his side. In the safety of a human colony, they grew closer. She wasn't just a survivor. She became his partner, helping humanity understand her people's technology and advocating for peace. Despite everything her people had done, she believed there was a chance for unity. And Ryan believed in her. Their bond deepened, their friendship turning into something more. Kalura confessed that Ryan had shown her more kindness than her own people ever had. And for Ryan, she became a reason to hope, a light in the darkness of war. When the war finally ended, it was Kalura who stood beside humanity, fighting for peace. And when Ryan asked her to stay with him forever, her answer was a tearful, joyous yes. Their wedding was more than a union. It was a symbol. Humans and Zilari alike watched as love bridged the gap between their worlds. But even as peace settled, danger still loomed. There were those who saw their love as a threat. But Ryan and Kalura stood together, ready to face whatever came next. They had survived the worst, and their love had only grown stronger. As they looked toward the stars, hand in hand, they knew one thing. Their story was only just begun. The air inside the ruined outpost was thick with dust and the faint scent of burning metal. The walls were cracked and blackened from past battles, and the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of explosions. Ryan Voss moved quickly, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The HUD of his combat suit flashed with alerts: low ammunition, fading power, and worsening life signs from the alien girl in his arms. Kalura's breathing was shallow and ragged, her violet skin pale against his chest. Her glowing blue eyes flickered open now and then, filled with pain and fear. He laid her down gently on a patch of clean ground and pulled off his gloves, his hand shaking as he reached for the last of his medical supplies. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Her skin was burning with fever, and the deep wounds on her body weren't healing. He cleaned them as best he could, sealing the worst with his limited med gel. But it wasn't enough. She needed real medical attention, and they were miles behind enemy lines with no backup in sight. "Ryan." Kalura's voice was barely a whisper. She looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Why? Why save me?" He didn't know how to answer. The Zilari had slaughtered his people, burning entire colonies to the ground. But when he'd found her, broken, helpless, and afraid, something in him couldn't leave her behind. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him, or maybe he was just tired of the endless cycle of death. "You didn't deserve to die out there," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not like that." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, slowly, her hand reached out and brushed against his. "Thank you," she whispered. Before he could respond, his motion scanner flashed a warning. Red blips, a lot of them, were closing in fast. His stomach twisted. The enemy had found them. "We need to move," he said, his voice tense. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and lifted Kalura into his arms once more. She was so light, her body fragile against his armored frame. Outside, the night was alive with danger. Drones buzzed through the air, and the sound of mechanized footsteps echoed through the ruins. Ryan moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. His every step was calculated, his every breath controlled. But the enemy was closing in. Kalura murmured something in her alien language, her head resting against his chest. He couldn't understand the words, but the pain in her voice was clear. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're almost there." But he didn't know where there was. There was no safe haven, no extraction team coming to save them. They were alone. A sudden burst of light illuminated the ruins ahead, the harsh glow of a Zilari searchlight. Ryan froze, pressing himself and Kaylura against a crumbling wall. The searchlight passed over them, and for a heartbeat, he thought they were safe. Then the first mech stepped into view. It was massive, a towering machine of metal and death, its energy cannon glowing with barely contained power. Ryan's breath caught as more followed, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. They were surrounded. "We can't fight them," he whispered, his mind racing. He had maybe a dozen shots left, and his cloaking device was on its last charge. Kaylura's fingers tightened on his arm. "Go," she said weakly. "Leave me. Save yourself." "Not happening," he growled. The mechs spread out, their searchlights sweeping the ruins. Ryan's mind worked fast. He needed a distraction. Carefully, he set Kaylura down behind a broken wall. "Stay here. Don't move." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving fast and low, his body a blur of shadows. He reached into his belt and pulled out a flash grenade, tossing it toward the mechs. The explosion of light and sound disoriented them, and Ryan moved. His first shot took down a drone. The second hit a mech's exposed joint, sending sparks flying. But there were too many. Energy blasts tore through the night, and the air filled with heat and fire. A shot grazed his shoulder, searing pain through his arm. He stumbled, but kept moving. If he stopped, they were both dead. Suddenly, a shot rang out from behind him. A Zilari blaster's distinct whine. One of the mechs staggered, its leg buckling. Ryan spun, and to his shock, saw Kaylura, pale and trembling, but on her feet, a blaster in her shaking hands. "Run," she shouted. He didn't need to be told twice. He reached her in seconds, scooping her up even as the mechs regrouped. They ran, the sound of mechanized death right behind them. By some miracle, they found shelter. A narrow tunnel beneath the ruins, just wide enough for the two of them. Ryan collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. Kaylura slumped against him, her breathing shallow. "You didn't leave me," she whispered. "Never," he said, his voice fierce. For a long time, there was only silence. Then Kaylura spoke again, her voice soft. "I'm not a soldier," she said. "I'm a scientist. I tried to stop this war." Tears welled in her glowing eyes. But no one listened. They wanted conquest. They didn't care about peace. Ryan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "You risk your life for peace." She nodded, her voice breaking. "And they betrayed me, left me to die." The walls between them began to fall. In that cold, dark tunnel, they weren't human or Zilari, just two people trying to survive a war neither of them wanted. The sound of footsteps above brought their quiet moment to an end. The enemy was still hunting them. Ryan tightened his grip on his rifle. "We'll get through this," he promised. Kaylura looked at him with quiet trust. "Together." He smiled, despite the fear in his chest. Together. They moved again, deeper into the ruins, the sound of their pursuers never far behind. The war had taken so much from both of them, but in the midst of destruction, something new had begun to grow. And Ryan would fight to protect it with everything he had. The night was alive with the sounds of war. Distant explosions, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the mechanical hum of enemy machines closing in. The ruined landscape stretched out before them like a graveyard, littered with the remains of ships and soldiers alike. Ryan Voss's breathing was ragged, his body aching from exhaustion and wounds, but he kept moving. There was no other choice. Kaylura clung to his side, her steps shaky and her violet skin pale. She was still feverish, and every few minutes she stumbled, but she refused to let go. Ryan admired her strength even as he worried about how much longer she could keep going. They had been running for hours, dodging patrols and enemy drones, and their luck was running out. "We're close," Ryan whispered, his eyes scanning the horizon. The extraction point was just beyond the next ridge. If they could make it there, they'd have a chance. But before they could take another step, his HUD flashed red. Motion detected. Lots of it. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Kalara behind a broken wall just as the first shots rang out. The enemy was here. Blaster fire tore through the night, and Ryan returned fire with brutal efficiency. His shots were precise, each one finding its mark. But there were too many. Sleek, black-armored Zilari soldiers and towering combat mechs that moved with terrifying speed. Their glowing red eyes swept the battlefield, and Ryan knew they wouldn't stop until both he and Kalara were dead. "Ryan." Kalara's voice was filled with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She picked up a fallen blaster, her hands trembling, and fired at the enemy. The shot went wide, but the next found its target, taking down a drone that had been circling toward them. "You're doing great," he called to her, even as he took down another soldier. But his ammo was running low, and the enemy kept coming. A missile streaked through the air, and the world exploded. Ryan hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. His combat suit's alarms were screaming. Cracked armor, broken ribs, and blood leaking from a wound on his side. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs wouldn't obey. "Ryan." Kalara was suddenly there, her hands on his face, her eyes wide with terror. "Stay with me, please." He wanted to tell her he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The world tilted dangerously, and darkness threatened to take him. But then he saw the enemy advancing. The mechs moving closer, their weapons glowing with deadly light. It was over. But just as the first mech raised its cannon, the night erupted with new firepower. Human reinforcements poured in from the ridge, their weapons blazing. The tide turned in an instant, and the enemy began to fall back. The mechs crumbled under concentrated fire, and the Zilari soldiers were forced into retreat. Through the haze of pain, Ryan felt strong arms lifting him. The medics had arrived, their voices urgent as they assessed his injuries. But even as they worked, his eyes stayed on Kalara. She was at his side, her hands gripping his tightly. Tears streaked her face, and when she spoke, her voice broke. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now, let me save you." As the world faded to black, her hand was the last thing he felt. Ryan woke to the steady beeping of medical monitors and the sterile scent of a recovery room. Pain flared through his body as he tried to sit up, and a soft hand pressed him back down. "Easy," Kalara's voice said gently. He turned his head and found her sitting beside his bed. She looked better. Her skin had regained its vibrant hue, and the feverish glaze in her eyes was gone. But the worry hadn't left her face. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough. "Of course I stayed," she whispered, her fingers brushing his hand. "I couldn't leave you, not after everything you did for me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "I want to help end this war, Ryan. I know things that could change everything, but I can't do it alone." "You won't have to," he said without hesitation. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, a quiet promise, a shared understanding. In the midst of war, they had found something worth fighting for, and neither of them was ready to let it go. The days after the battle passed in a blur of pain and recovery. Ryan Voss lay in a sterile medical bay, his body patched up but still aching with every movement. The war had taken its toll on him, not just physically, but in ways he couldn't quite describe. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: Kalara. She was always there. When he woke from fevered nightmares, she was the one who calmed him. When the pain became too much, her soft voice soothed him. She stayed by his side when others would have walked away. And as the days turned into weeks, Ryan found himself relying on her presence more than he realized. Kalara had changed too. In the safety of the human colony, far from the front lines, she began to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. The fear that had once filled her eyes was replaced by determination. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was someone with a purpose. She spent hours with human scientists and strategists, sharing what she knew of her people's technology and the inner workings of the Zilari Dominion. Her knowledge was invaluable, and it quickly became clear that without her help, humanity would have never stood a chance. But it wasn't just her brilliance that captured Ryan's attention. It was her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the colony's horizon, they sat together outside the medical bay. The sky burned with shades of orange and violet, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Kalara's eyes reflected the colors, glowing softly in the fading light. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Ryan didn't answer right away. He watched the sky, the memories of that night flashing through his mind. The fear, the fire, the way she had looked up at him, broken and terrified, and still so very alive. "Because you didn't deserve to die," he said finally. "Because I saw someone who needed help, and I couldn't turn my back on that." She smiled then, a small, fragile thing. "My own people wouldn't have done the same." "That's their loss," he said, his voice gentle. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. Something that had been growing since the moment he'd carried her out of the flames. It was more than trust, more than gratitude. It was something deeper, something neither of them dared to name just yet. The war raged on, but the colony remained a sanctuary, a place where hope began to take root. And as Ryan regained his strength, he and Kalara grew closer. They trained together, fought side by side in simulations, and shared quiet moments when the weight of the conflict became too much. One night, as they sat around a small fire, Kalara spoke of her past. She told him about her life as a scientist, how she had fought against her people's hunger for conquest, and how that defiance had led to her being abandoned on the battlefield. "I never believed in this war," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they didn't care. They saw me as weak, a traitor. If you hadn't found me." "You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for," Ryan interrupted softly. "And you're not alone anymore." She looked at him then, and in that moment, the walls between them crumbled completely. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and the firelight danced across their skin. As the days turned into weeks, that bond only grew stronger. What had started as trust became friendship, and then something more. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the colony, Kalara turned to him, her eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. "I never thought I'd find a home here," she said quietly. "But with you, I feel safe. I feel happy." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He reached up, brushing a strand of her shimmering hair behind her ear. "You are home," he whispered. "With me." Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss, and in that single touch, the world around them faded away. The war, the fear, the pain, none of it mattered. In that moment, all that existed was them. When the news finally came that the war was ending, it was Kalara who stood beside humanity, advocating for peace. Her voice carried weight, and her bravery inspired others, even those who had once called her an enemy. And when the fighting finally stopped, when the weapons were laid down and the treaties were signed, Ryan knew there was only one thing left he wanted. As they stood together in the aftermath of it all, he took her hands in his and looked into those glowing blue eyes he had come to love so deeply. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Not because of the war, not because of what we've been through. Stay because I love you, and I don't want to face this life without you." Tears welled in her eyes, and her answer came in a single breathless word: yes. In the ruins of war, they had found something beautiful, and together they would build a future worth fighting for. Their wedding was not just a simple ceremony. It was a moment that would be remembered by both humans and Zilari alike, a symbol of unity in a world that had known nothing but war for so long. Ryan and Kalara stood before their people, hand in hand, their eyes filled with love and hope. They were no longer just an unlikely pair of survivors. They were the living proof that even in the darkest of times, something beautiful could emerge. The venue was an open area surrounded by lush greenery, a stark contrast to the barren, war-torn land they had once known. The ruins of the battlefield had given way to something new, something that breathed life instead of death. It was a hopeful beginning, not only for them, but for all those who had fought so hard for peace. Kalara stood in a flowing gown, her violet skin shimmering in the sunlight. It was a simple dress, made from the finest materials the human colony could provide. But to Ryan, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was radiant, not just in her appearance, but in the way she had transformed from a soldier to a beacon of hope. Ryan wore a military uniform, now modified for the occasion. His armor had been discarded in favor of something less practical but far more meaningful. His eyes, however, still carried the weight of the war, the pain of everything they had lost, and the quiet promise to never forget. The ceremony itself was brief, but it didn't need to be long to carry immense weight. The officiator, a human representative of the Peace Council, spoke of love, sacrifice, and the possibility of a future free from the shadows of war. But it was the vows, spoken softly by Ryan and Kalara, that made the moment truly unforgettable. Ryan's voice was steady but filled with emotion. Kalara, when I found you, you were broken, and so was I. But together, we've rebuilt not only ourselves but the world around us. I promise to stand by you, not just in peace, but in every challenge we face. I'll protect you, love you, and honor you, always. Kalara's voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. Ryan, you saved me when I had nothing left. You showed me what love is, and you gave me a future I never thought possible. I promise to stand by your side, to fight for you and for our people. I'll never let go, no matter what comes. When they exchanged rings, simple, handmade bands, the crowd erupted in applause. But it wasn't just the humans who cheered. The Zilari, who had once seen Ryan as an enemy, stood in silence, their faces filled with a mixture of respect and awe. Many of them had come to understand that Kalara's love for Ryan was not a betrayal, but a sign of hope for their future. But even in the midst of celebration, Ryan and Kalara knew the peace they had fought so hard for was fragile. There were still factions within the Zilari Dominion who viewed their love as a threat. Those who believed that peace was an illusion and that humanity's rise was a challenge to their power. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Ryan and Kalara sat together on a balcony overlooking the colony. The laughter from the wedding reception faded into the background as they shared a quiet moment. Do you think they'll ever accept us? Kalara asked softly, her head resting on Ryan's shoulder. Ryan didn't hesitate. We've already proven them wrong, haven't we? We survived the worst, Kalara. We fought when everyone told us we couldn't, and we're still here. And as long as we're together, we'll keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who believes in a better world. She nodded, her eyes glimmering with determination. I'm not afraid of what comes next, Ryan. Not when I have you. Ryan kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with love. And I'll never let you go. We'll face whatever comes, side by side. The following days were filled with both celebration and tension. There were moments of laughter, of quiet conversations with friends who had become family, but there were also hushed discussions in private rooms, warnings from diplomats, and threats from those who didn't believe in the new world they were trying to build. Ryan and Kalara knew that their journey wasn't over. They had fought for survival, for peace, and now they would fight for the future they had promised to each other. The first sign of trouble came sooner than they had expected. A group of Zilari extremists, still loyal to the war-hungry leaders of the Dominion, began to stir unrest in the outer colonies. They believed that by disrupting the fragile peace, they could force the Zilari people back into war. Their message was clear. The alliance with humanity was a betrayal, and Kalara's marriage to Ryan was an insult to their honor. Ryan and Kalara knew this was coming. They had hoped for peace, but they were prepared for the fight that still loomed. They spent hours in discussions, strategizing with military leaders and diplomats, trying to figure out how to combat the growing threat without plunging their worlds back into war. The first skirmishes were small, a few attacks on human convoys and a few scattered raids in the outer colonies. But it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Ryan, now fully recovered from his injuries, was once again called to the front lines. He and Kaylura stood together, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. But this time, they were not alone. The peace they had fought for was not just a dream of two people, it was a dream shared by many. And as they stood at the forefront of that struggle, they were surrounded by allies, humans and Zalari who had come to believe in the vision of a united future. One evening, as they prepared for another battle, Kaylura turned to Ryan with a look of determination. "We'll make it through this. We have to." Ryan kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with a promise. "We will. We've come this far, Kaylura, and we're not going back." The battle that followed was fierce, but it wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about the future of both their peoples. Every victory, every small triumph, brought them one step closer to the peace they had dreamed of. When the final battle was won, and the last of the extremist forces had been defeated, Ryan and Kaylura stood on the battlefield, not as conquerors, but as symbols of the hope that had led them through the darkest of times. As they looked toward the stars, hand in hand, they knew that their story was far from over. They had won this fight, but there would always be challenges ahead. Together, they would face them, as partners, as warriors, and as a symbol of what love could achieve. And so, as the dawn of a new era broke, Ryan and Kaylura stood ready. Their love had carried them through the worst of times, and it would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Together, they had built a future worth fighting for, and they would protect it, no matter the cost. Their story was only just beginning.